thanks to the head of the department and the cohort of faculty members for organizing this very important conference and inviting me to it. I have a rather longish title, as you can see. It's called Writing the Earth Darkly, the Green Literary Imperative in the Anthropocene, very long. So I'm going to tell you a couple of stories to kind of set the title in perspective. Right? The first anecdote or story is from Sukanta Chowdhury's The Metaphysics of the Text. This is how Sukanta Chowdhury, the reputed cultural critic, begins. So he refers to this story from the Dhammapada, the Buddhist text. So there is Gautama Buddha, there is his student Ananda, and Ananda's student is reciting something very strange. It is better to have lived one day with the knowledge of the heron rather than live 100 days without the knowledge of the heron. Now, Ananda gets very angry because what the student has actually done is, in the original Pali, instead of saying Udayavyayam, which means the beginning and ending of things, he is actually, misread it as Udakabaka, which in Pali means the heron bird. So Ananda scolds the disciple, and Buddha, who is witnessing this entire conversation, calls the disciple aside and says, "Don't worry about your teacher Ananda. He doesn't know what he's saying. You are indeed right. Heron in the water is the correct interpretation." So heron in the water, the greening of literature, the greening of humanities is what I'm going to be talking today about. And I come from this very specific subdomain called eco-criticism, the greening of literature. That's the second part of my talk. Now, I have one more anecdote to perhaps spur this talk, right? Raymond Williams says nature is the most complex word in the English language, and it is equally complex for eco-critics also. Let me give you a small example. This is the story, the second story. This is a step-by-step enlightenment guide attributed to a 12th century Zen master, Qin Yuan. Qin Yuan writes, "Before I studied Zen, I saw mountains as mountains, waters as waters. When I arrived at a more intimate knowledge, I came to the point when mountains are not mountains and waters are not waters. But now that I've got the very essence of knowledge, I now see mountains once again as mountains, rivers, waters once again as waters." Now, is this a Zen koan, right? Because Qin Yuan is actually defining a Satori moment, a moment of enlightenment. So are the three understandings the same or different, he asks. The question can be related to our troubled environmental times. See, the master passes through three stages of ecological enlightenment. In the beginning, he takes nature for granted, mountains as mountains, waters as waters. The next stage, he is like all of us, into very fashionable literary critical theory, and he goes on to reduce nature to a mere construct of the mind, a sign within the signifying system. I saw that mountains are not mountains, waters are not waters. And finally, he enters, when he becomes truly enlightened, he enters into a larger enlightenment, which includes mountains, waters, as well as minds. Now, as a result of the planetary tragedy that our epoch is witnessing, because this conference is very significantly titled The Roboticized Millennium and What is the Function of Literature? I'm talking about the green imperative, something which is very crucial, very essential. In fact, I'm sure most of us have heard of this canonical work, The Structure of Scientific Revolution by Thomas Kuhn. So Thomas Kuhn speaks about paradigm shifts which govern metaphors regarding to um, theorization in the sciences. We're talking about science theory, and Kuhn is saying, well, I mean, we have to be careful about the metaphors we use because paradigms shift all the time. So we can say with confidence that we have to be careful about the conceptual frameworks that we are using to understand what surrounds us, because environment is basically, if you go back to the French word environment, it means something which surrounds, basically, right? So look at modernism. So modernism told us that nature is not personal, and but nature is ordered by laws. So if you understand those laws, if you master those laws, you can master nature as well. Postmodernism told us, well, nature or reality is not personal, it is not ordered. So whatever approach you take to reality is relative, and whatever value you ascribe to it is just your own. But an ecological approach would say that nature is personal and it is ordered. And this order is constituted by millions of beings, human, greater than human, who are trying to actualize themselves in multidimensional relationships, right? So let me go back. Various schools of critical theory since the 1960s have participated in the denaturalization of nature, and the revision of which is one of the most important aims of eco-criticism. It has become almost obligatory to declare that there is no such thing as nature, since nature has been reduced to a term within cultural discourse, a sign within a signifying system. Similarly, eco-philosopher Kate Soper protests against the reduction of nature to a mere linguistic construct by pointing out that, in short, it is not language which has a hole in the ozone layer. The real thing continues to be polluted and degraded even as we refine our deconstructive insights at the level of the signifier. So we are trying to talk about the real thing, quote unquote. I'm quoting from Kate Soper, of course. The real thing is difficult to define. Raymond Williams also admits to the impossibility of the task almost. Let me also draw your attention to an influential book by a journalist called Bill McKibben. It's an important book on climate change titled The End of Nature. This book came out in the year 1989, and it discusses how nature as we know it, due to excessive modification by humans, has ended, right? So, the end of nature, we must remember, is not the death of nature, right? The end of nature is the end of certain ideas that we have about nature. The idea of an independent, mysterious force that is beyond human control. And McKibben says we have changed the atmosphere, we are changing the weather, we have deprived nature of its independence, and that is fatal to its meaning. Nature's independence is in its meaning, and without it, there is nothing but us. So, nature in this new paradigm is just reduced to a problem that needs to be worked out through human intervention. Now I come to the first part of my title, Writing the Earth Darkly. So the adjective dark I borrow from the object-oriented philosopher and cultural critic Timothy Morton, from the title of his book Dark Ecology, and also a later book called Ecology Without Nature. In these books, Morton argues that the very idea of nature as a transcendental independent term, which informs arts, ethics, philosophy, and ecological politics, may have to become obsolete with a heightened understanding of what truly constitutes ecological thinking. So, in other words, the ecological thought does not refer to natural things alone. On the other hand, it denotes the interconnected mesh of everything that surrounds us and of which we are a part. And Morton concludes famously that to think in a truly ecological way, we must let go of nature. So the essence of these new ideas is the notion of coexistence. That's what all ecology profoundly means. So we can coexist with human life forms, non-human life forms, non-life forms, the ecosystem, the biosphere, climate, planet, solar system. So it's like a multiple series of nested Russian dolls. The big doll will contain a smaller doll, and that will contain a smaller doll, and so on. That's how the universe actually works. So, who are we and where are we becomes a very complex and riddled question in the Anthropocene. I've used the word Anthropocene in my title, in the latter part of my title. So, what is the Anthropocene? It's a term coined by Eugene Stormer in the 1980s and popularized by Paul Crutzen in the 2000s, a disputed term referring to a new epoch in which human actions have irreparably affected the planet. So we live in a world where the impact of humanity upon the Earth's natural processes is frighteningly evident. In fact, atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide have recently passed the dreaded 400 parts per million threshold, the ppm threshold. And it's interesting that post-lockdown, in New York, there was a survey, and they found out that carbon monoxide and other planet-heating gases have been reduced by 50% because automobiles were not used. But the prediction is it will come back with a vengeance. So whatever it is, biodiversity loss or the vanishing of species 100 times faster than without human interference, it points to Earth's sixth mass extinction. It will be the first caused by humans. So we are entering a new epochal consciousness, to use Carl Jasper's phrase. So when did this geological era begin? Did it start in 1492 with Columbus and the European Holocaust in the Americas? Did it begin in 1784 with the invention of the steam engine, which ushered in the Industrial Revolution? With the explosion of the atom bomb in 1945, or what is called the Great Acceleration, the spread of industrialization in the world since then? The conclusion, regardless of all these dates, is that human history cannot be understood as separate from the history of the Earth. Bruno Latour has famously argued in his classic work, We Have Never Been Modern, that modernity as a successful and rational framework of thinking has been challenged by the Anthropocene. So, we can define the Anthropocene as an era of complex entanglements between nature or other than human forces and human action, what is normally referred to by post-humanists as entangled humanism. So in this paradigm, nature is no longer the passive background, but an active protagonist. Hence, the dichotomy between agential man and passive nature is fundamentally challenged. So the major insight that the Anthropocene offers is a larger concept of selfhood. Donna Haraway has a beautiful phrase for it. He calls it becoming with. So what is this becoming with? Becoming with is a performance. It is a cultivation of interconnections. It is an act of resistance against the threats of extinction, which involves how we tell stories through and with other stories. So we can consider the Anthropocene to be some kind of a clarion call to new modes of knowing, new modes of engaging in ways that are less human-centered or anthropocentric. So read in this way, the Anthropocene is inescapably bound up with an ethical demand. It announces our need to inhabit this world in a spirit of mindful accountability, not just to those who happen to live with us now, but to all the multi species generations who will come after us, right? The major challenge in humanities is how do we find new ways to represent this planetary tragedy, right? Amitav Ghosh, the reputed novelist, in his recent book on climate change, observes that in a substantially altered world, readers and consumers of art will look for traces of these changes in literature and the arts. Any expectation of normalcy, balance, and order will tantamount to what Ghosh calls the great derangement. Well, the world we live in is witnessing a radical eclipse of nature. I'm using Frederick Jameson's phrase, a radical eclipse of nature in which even the timeless natural order cannot be taken for granted because nature has been relentlessly modified by man. Hence, environmental narratives that characterize our times have abandoned the romantic return to an Edenic myth of pastoral plenitude and pristine wilderness and turn increasingly towards a truly materialist vision that articulates dispossession, loss, disease, and a whole host of themes that characterizes the dark thanatos of environmental pollution, toxicity, and slow violence. That's why we have to write the earth darkly, right? It is dark ecology. We have to own our trash. We have to own our detritus. We have to see that as compost for purposeful action. Well, there are innumerable ways that these narratives connect the personal and political, the home and the world, the rural and the urban, human and the more than human, human and the machine, the local and the global. And these narratives help us enter what deep ecologist Alan Drenson refers to as free narrative spaces. So, what is a free narrative space? It's an important function of eco-criticism. Um, and a free narrative space is one which is not controlled by dominating hierarchies, spaces that are more or less liberated from controlling stories. It's only in these open spaces, visions that the alternative tales of sustainability, earth democracy, and a whole host of issues can be given free expression. These narratives are articulated in terms of systems that are open ended and creative because we have moved away, right, from the binary, Cartesian binary to the system approach, the system thinking approach. And systems thinking is contextual. And all of us are contextual beings. They are all imbricated in the earth and its processes. So, beat poet and bioregionalist Gary Snyder famously remarks, I quote, narratives are one sort of trace that we leave in the world. All our literature are leavings. So, eco criticism is a part of this gestalt and grand storytelling attempt. It can even be called a story of all things, which makes possible a literary appreciation and creation that is local as well as global, where there is no one dominant story. Since the 1960s, there has been an extraordinary surge of important North American writing about the relationship between human beings and the natural world. This body of literature is called nature writing or environmental writing, and I think the impetus for this came from that famous interdisciplinary work called Silent Spring by biologist Rachel Carson, writing in the 1960s about pesticides like DDT, dialdrin, and aldrin. Um, Carson discovered that entire bird species seemed to be dropping off, and she suspected that it was harmful for human beings as well. So whenever she attempted to write about it, using a typical academic register, I think the agro-business industry opposed her. So she wrote The Silent Spring in an effort to rouse people from their slumber of unknowingness, right? And it's interesting that she borrowed two tropes from literature: the pastoral and the apocalypse, because the pastoral and the apocalypse, perhaps we get these tropes from the Bible, and they are ancient ways of imagining our relationship to the planet. So, A Silent Spring begins with a fable. Carson calls it a fable. So it begins as a fairy tale story. Once upon a time, there was a town in the heart of America. So Carson will go on to talk about deer in the valley, a silverfish which swim merrily in the streams, and the pastoral is invoked, right? So there is so much of richness and simplicity in this, typical American town. And then the genre veers to the apocalypse. Then she says, a sudden blight descended on the town. Um, was it witchcraft? No, they had done it to themselves. And as all of us must have guessed, the title Silent Spring is taken or is borrowed from John Keats's La Belle Dame sans Mercy. So the beautiful lady without mercy, where the magical lady leaves the landscape barren. So the question which we would like to ask ourselves is, why did Carson use rhetoric? Because basically the first chapter of Silent Spring, which should actually be a scientifically written chapter, is like a literary fable. Why did she use rhetoric? Because rhetoric rouses emotions in people. So that's why she used it. So that brings us to another important question. Um, are eco-critics allowed to talk about any issues? Because I've been telling you that eco-critics comment about scientific problems, right? So let me qualify my statement and say eco-criticism or eco-critics talk about those environmental issues which are perhaps partially concealed in cultural spaces. Um, uh, so there is a difference again between ecological problems and problems in ecology. So ecological problems can be handled only by scientists. I don't think humanists can take care of that. Let me give you an example. This is an example given by Don Passos. So he throws open a question. Define a weed, WEED. You can type in the chat box if you want to define a weed. A weed. Okay. I think anybody wants to respond to that. What is a weed? Okay. Most of us will say that a weed is an unwanted plant which has to be destroyed. I mean, that's the popular, yeah. Well, that's very nuanced. It's a non-wanted plant. Its signification lies in itself. Absolutely right, Nupur, because, for example, Prosopis in Chennai, from the campus from where I come, we have huge tracts of Prosopis, and we followed the government's orders. We've cut it down because these trees drink up ground water and they proliferate like crazy. But the same species of Prosopis is revered in Rajasthan because it is drought resistant. It can feed the cattle. So is Prosopis a weed? So a weed is not an unwanted plant, but perhaps it's a wrong plant in the wrong place. So eco-critics can perhaps debate about how a weed is defined or how certain things are defined culturally. I'll be speaking about it in a short while, but I'm going to give you a very quick overview of eco-criticism. I'm not going to spend much time. We don't have time, but let's do a quick overview. Since the 1960s, it began mainly as a North American phenomenon, and the Eco-Criticism Reader, which was published in 1992, edited by Harold Fromm and Cheryl Glotfelty, famously defined eco-criticism as the relationship between literature and the physical environment. So, an important landmark in the history of eco-criticism was the founding of ASLE, the Association for Study of Literature and the Environment in the United States. So, ASLE has partner institutions all over the world: India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Japan, Singapore, Australia, Canada. So, there are many countries, and eco-criticism has come a long way since the 1990s, where it. Yes, sorry. Was there a question? Okay. So it has come a long way. Um, I mean, as a small North American phenomenon. In fact, the term eco-criticism was first used by William Rueckert in his essay "Literature and Ecology: An Experiment in Eco-Criticism" in 1978. But the roots of this emergent Earth-centric literary theory lie deep in the past. In fact, Scott Slovic, a foundational eco-critic, effectively sums up this paradox. He says, "After more than 3 decades of doing this work, I still cannot pinpoint the Earth text of eco-criticism, the absolute source." I think those of us who hail from Tamil Nadu will, of course, identify with the Aintinai bioregional theory. That's one of the finest expressions of, embodied living, right? And the Sangam poetry can be subjected to a fine eco-critical analysis. And the Sangam Tamils, people who lived in these 5 eco-zones, in perfect consonance with the deity, with the culture, customs, occupation, and each of these eco-zones is even associated with a particular emotion. So, so does eco-criticism begin with Tinai? Or does it begin with something similar in China, right? So all countries have, I think, a way, or all cultures have a way of integrating nature into their cultural spheres, right? So we can't, just call it a Western phenomenon. That's what Scott Slovic is alluding to. So William Howard, again a prominent eco-critic, tries to trace the etymology of the term eco-criticism. So eco-criticism is made up of 2 words: oikos, meaning household, and kritis, meaning judge. So the home, earth is a home, or perhaps we speak of a small homes, we speak of a city as home, of a country as home. But the idea is to consider earth as home. It's our largest homestead. And kritis, 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 which means judge, she is the arbiter of taste who wants to keep the house in good order. No boots or dishes strewn about to ruin the original decor. So that's William Howard's definition of eco-criticism. And I think Greeks also had a clear-cut distinction between the oikion and the politikon, because oikos is the home, is the root word for ecology, economics, so many branches of knowledge that we study today. The Greeks divided space into 2 dichotomous zones, the oikion and the politikon, what the Sangam poetry would call aham and puram. So who were consigned to the oikion? Women, servants, pets, children, and the politikon was the space of men, important state affairs, politics, and so on and so forth. So that is why ecology or environmental writing is also the discourse of the secluded. Today, green writing is invariably also tied to matters of gender, to matters of justice. So writing the oikon is perhaps the overarching, objective of eco-criticism. And in that sense, eco-criticism has a lot of, interfusion with other disciplines like gender studies, justice studies, or globalization studies. It's quite fascinating, right? So the first wave of eco-criticism, let me give you a whirlwind tour of eco-criticism, or at least the development of the genre. There are various metaphors used to describe it. There is the wave metaphor. There is also the rhizome metaphor. Deleuze and Guattari talk about the rhizome. Let me use the wave metaphor because uh, it's more widely used, and it helps us to kind of map the evolution of the discipline. So the first wave, which began in the 1980s, defined nature as natural environment. It focused on British and American literature and argued for the protection and preservation of the natural environment against marauding humans. So the setting up the wilderness parks, well, they chased out the native Indians, but the focus is just on conservation, preservation. Ramachandra Guha, writing later, would offer a critique of first world environmentalism. But that was the first way: protect nature at all costs, right? So nature means green nature, pristine nature. The second wave, which happened in the mid 1990s, moved away from dichotomized discourses of nature writing to a more inclusive dialogue, which included urban landscapes in addition to wilderness, rural scapes. It also included multicultural voices. You see the beginnings of environmental justice, eco criticism during the second wave. Well, the third wave advanced the concerns of the second wave. We can date it to approximately the year 2000. And this is marked by a comparist tendency across national and ethnic cultures. So, Joni Adamson and Scott Slovic, in a 2009 special issue of Malus, talk about the third wave as an insurgence of a diversity of voices contributing to the understanding of the human relationship to the planet. So, eco-criticism of this period is marked by concepts such as eco-cosmopolitanism that reveal the dialectical tension between the local and global sense of place. Um, to give you an example, I'm sure all of us are familiar with the Plachimada struggle. One lone tribal woman called Mailama, she opposed the Coca-Cola plant because the water in her well was going dry, right? So Coca-Cola had to shut down because the whole thing swelled into an environmental justice movement. Now, eco-cosmopolitanism would connect Mailama's struggle to perhaps all the environmental justice struggles happening in the world, because even the global north has pockets of global south. If you read novelists like Anna Castillo, So Far From God, you realize that, well, people of color are being exploited. And whenever capitalism raises its ugly head, whenever there is toxicity, and whenever there is toxic waste to be discharged in a cheap manner, I think the people who get hit are the subalterns. So, environmental injustice also has a racial hue. So, well, coming to the fourth wave is about the focalization of theory on the fundamental materiality of environmental things, places, processes, forces, and experience. We can think of important works like Material Feminisms, a book which came out in 2008, edited by Stacey Alamo and Susan Ekman, which emphasizes the inherent materiality of the human body and the natural world. It draws attention to how the retreat from materiality and its denial has had serious consequences for feminist theory and practice. Now I move on to the second part of my talk. I'm going to give you an example of eco-critical interpretative practice, and a topic which I'm going to take up today is called swamp speak. or speaking of swamps. And I'm doing this to illustrate that literary texts wield immense power in shaping geographical imagination. Um, by using the example of swarms that have represented the trope of wilderness for writers from diverse backgrounds and periods of history. So the text analyzed will come from diverse writers like John Bunyan, Thoreau, Gary Snyder, Sarah Joseph, whose work brings to light an evolving cultural commentary on the status of wetlands and powerfully articulates a wetland ethic. Now, eco-critics are supposed to also um, draw from science. So what is the science of wetlands? See, from a scientific point of view, wetlands offer incredible natural biodiversity. They function as nature's kidneys. They help in long-term carbon storage, water cycles, and the moderating effects they can have on climate change are really significant. And they are global habitats occurring from plains to alpine regions. And they're also ecotones. Ecotones are transition areas between two biomes or distinct biological communities. Um, so, a wetland cannot be described as a terrestrial or aquatic landscape, right? Cultural geographer William Howarth draws attention to the hybrid and multivalent nature of wetlands, referring to them as waterlands, a continuum between terra and aqua. Okay, so this is the science of wetlands, and despite the amazing role that wetlands play in an ecosystem, humans have always resisted them and regarded them with great hostility. So what are the reasons, right? Wetlands are claustrophobic. They do not offer a sense of horizon. They don't give you grand views. And they often force humans to turn inward upon themselves and the non-human world. And wetlands constitute processes of perennial becoming and hence must be understood as a patient environment where things change very, very, very slowly, right? Um, I don't know whether we can talk about Shakespeare's glowing line. Those are pearls that were his eyes, that doth suffer a sea change into something rich and precious. So the very idea of the human organ decaying in water and turning into something precious, Shakespeare talks about it. That's a patient environment. If left undisturbed, these patient environments can transform muck into peat, coal, and other substances of value to the extraction industry. At the cultural level, the slowness of the process can inspire feelings of patience or alienation. And two, since wetlands are transition zones between water and land, they can inspire divided values like difficulty or uncertainty. And most importantly, I think wetlands are anoxic, meaning methane gas producing, which is of little use to humans who require oxygen-rich air. So as a result of growing human interference, wetlands have receded through the world, so much so that they have become the landscape equivalent of extinct or endangered species. So wetland drainage has constituted a major part of the eco-disaster that followed the European colonization of America. Wetlands were considered to be dangerous places that were the breeding grounds of deadly diseases. Miasmatic is the word. So at the time of the European invasion of the early 1600s, the area that would be later called the United States of America, 6 states lost more than 85% of their wetland cover. But I think pre-colonial native Indians who thrived in the swamps, they practiced subsistence farming, foraging, hunting. So if we look at the history of the United States, the marginalization of indigenous people and the draining of wetlands became parallel processes in the colonial machinery. The conversion of marshlands into fertile agricultural lands contributed to the idea of America as an agrarian republic envisioned by founding fathers of the nation, such as Thomas Jefferson. Letters from an American farmer celebrated the coming of age of the civilized new nation by calling attention to how the world is gradually settled, how the howling swamp is converted into a pleasing meadow, the rough ridge into a fine field. I'm sure all of us are familiar with the Puritan William Bradford, who came out with his book of Plymouth Plantation, which describes the early years of the foundation of colonies by the Pilgrim Fathers. That's a clear illustration of the colonizers' hostility towards the land. And Bradford refers to the New World and its original inhabitants as a hideous, I quote, as a hideous and desolate wilderness full of wild beasts and wild men. And Bradford's hostility to the New England environment was colored by his Puritan outlook. His writings establish the Pilgrims as covenant people by comparing the trials and tribulations in the New World with the 40 years of wandering in the desert wilderness of Sinai by the Hebrews. The Puritans, they took inspiration from their own religious legacy to have dominion of the earth and all its creatures. They did not approve of the fact that native Indians did not enclose their lands or raise livestock or hold title deeds. The European colonizers attempted to modify the landscape in the spirit of the Protestant passion for reformation. So these sentiments find full expression in the Great Swamp War, fought in December 1675 during King Philip's war between the colonial army of New England and the Narragansett tribe, in which the Puritan forces and their native allies killed hundreds of men, women, and children. The scoring of the swamp and the incineration of the Native American settlement were seen as necessary steps for the spiritual and physical cleansing of the place. So I'm going to begin with John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, which was published 3 years after the Great Swarm. So John Bunyan work powerfully illustrates Puritan attitudes. It objectifies the natural world. It reduces it to a set of symbols for instruction. As all of us probably know, it's a religious allegory presented as a dream sequence in which the central character, Christian, the figure of every man, flees his hometown, the city of destruction, in search of the celestial city. However, the way is fraught with temptations, dangers, digressions into the wilderness that distract the pilgrim from the straight and narrow path. So Bunyan chastises his readers to rouse themselves from feebleness of will and despondency by describing a dream in which he sees Christian and his fickle-minded friend Pliable fall into a filthy quagmire, which is called the Slough of Despond. And this is what Bunyan has to say about it. The miry slough is such a place that cannot be mended. It is the descent whither the scum and filth that attends conviction for sin doth continually run, and therefore it's called the Slough of Despond. It has swallowed up at least 20,000 cartloads, yea, millions of wholesome instructions. So words associated with wetlands like bog, swamp, fen, mire, black water have claustrophobic undertones of entrapment, disease, death, and disorientation. A whole range of derogatory meanings which Duckert calls the human fear of interstitial geography. So that's why we need a counter tradition of swamp speak that can challenge the rigid conceptual binaries and knowledge practices by emphasizing what environmental thinkers like Timothy Morton refer to as the mesh, the anamorphous rhizomatic networks which that we share with the non-human. Puritan's stern monologue is rectified by, the transcendental, tramp Henry David Thoreau, right? So, so he, in his beautiful essay, Walking, which from Walden, I mean, he writes this. He says, I enter a swamp as a sacred place, a sanctum sanctorum. There is strength, the marrow of nature. In a way, perhaps Thoreau is reimagining Milton's stern monologue, who silenced the swamp and its non human presences through an act of Puritan fervor that seeks to place God's locus in the everlasting city, which is a spatial condensation of civitas and order. So instead of looking for heaven in a transcendental space away from the earth or beyond the earth, um, Thoreau, the transcendentalist, places it squarely in the swamp. So this is a great revisionist exercise, in my opinion. In fact, if I can digress for a moment, I'd like to draw attention to a very controversial essay written by a Harvard scholar, which was published in the 1980s. So it's called The Historical Roots of our Ecological Crisis. And the name of this author is one Lynn White Jr. And he, uh, he criticizes theology, more specifically the book of Genesis. And he says, well, I mean, Western civilization has based its environmental conquest around the caveats of this book. Um, because in Genesis, God asks man to subdue the earth and to have dominion over the birds that fly in the air and the fish that swim in the waters. But John Lynn White Jr. Rightly met with a lot of criticism. I think a lot of significant biblical scholars wrote back saying, no, you are wrong. What the Bible actually says is, yes, the earth is created for mankind. So the good Lord said, take care of the earth. So you have the stewardship theory, which has been a very, very important contribution of Christianity to the environmental movement. Similarly, we see that all major world religions have spoken in favor of nature protection, right? So much so that Yale University and Harvard University, both these universities are engaged in that. And Harvard University has this whole series of books, Hinduism and ecology, Christianity and ecology, Islam and ecology, Jainism and ecology. So the accent of all these religious texts are to consider the earth as sacred, because that's what most creation theories emphasize. So Lynn White Jr. and perhaps even Bunyan was very wrong. To Thoreau, coming back to Thoreau, walking was a means of transcending the set patterns of quotidian life and a metaphor for self-renewal. So he criticizes mechanical quality of city life and the emptiness of a modern society. And he prefers the clean, dry air of the swamps, which he equates with freedom and wild nature. Thoreau states, hope and the nature and future, for me, are not the lawns and cultivated fields, not in towns and cities, but in the impervious and quaking swamps. So in this essay, we have an interesting symbolic marriage of two images: the Garden of Eden, which is the ubiquitous pastoral trope of Western literature, and the dark, dismal swamp. So what emerges is an ecologically sensitive vision of a dark Eden. So when you write the earth darkly, you are just not talking about toxic landscapes, redeeming toxic landscapes, but you're also talking about scapes like swamps, which have been given bad press by humans for many, many years due to their own cultural prejudices. See, Thoreau speaks of the primitive forest that rots in the bowels of the swamp. So when he does this, he is drawing attention to the abundant biodiversity of the swampscapes, that forms the bedrock of all civilizations. So the wetland ethic that emerges from the essay is a call for a deep recognition of this generosity. I quote from Walking: "The civilized nations, Greece, Rome, England, have been sustained by primitive forests which anciently rotted where they stand. They survive as long as the soil is not exhausted. Alas for human culture, little is to be expected of a nation when the vegetable mold is exhausted." So Thoreau's Swamp Speak exhorts the reader to bring your sills up to the very edges of the swamp. He says, "Come and live on the borders of the swamp." So when he's asking the reader to do is to do this, what he's asking us to do is to reconceptualize our dwelling spaces in a manner that reminds us of our ancient ties to this cradle of civilization. And I also want to read out this poem by Gary Snyder. Um, I will not spoil the poem by over explaining it, but Snyder is obviously talking about the swamp. But please note how exquisitely he brings out the gestalt of the swamp, right? And the poem is called "The Second Shaman Song." A shaman in native Indian cultures is some kind of a healer. He's some kind of a medicine man, a person with extraordinary skills. He can communicate with the heavens as well as with the earth. So a shaman heals the society. So the second shaman song by Gary Snyder: "Squat in swamp shadows, mosquitoes sting, high light in cedar above, crouched in a dry vein frame, thirst for cold snow, green slime of bone marrow, sea water fills each eye, quivering in nerve and muscle, hung in the pelvic cradle, bones propped against roots, a blind flicker of nerve, still hand moves out alone, flowering and leafing, turning to quartz, streaked rock congestion of karma, the long body of the swamp, a mud-streaked thigh, dying carp biting air in the damp grass. River recedes, no matter. Limp fish sleep in the weeds. The sun dries me as I dance. Now, who's the shaman in this whole piece? Who's the shaman? Because you have life as well as death and decay being simultaneously portrayed in this poem. And the shaman is perhaps the swamp itself, which is not a single thing. Yes, yeah,
Swarnalata ma'am.
yeah,
Swarnalata ma'am.
yeah, I can hear you.
Sorry to interrupt you, ma'am. Hello, ma'am. Can you
Yes,
hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
Yes, ma'am. Sorry to interrupt, ma'am. We
No.
have the next session at 2:30, ma'am.
Okay, so shall I conclude? We have looked at two or three. Shall I conclude?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, just give me a minute.
Yes, ma'am.
So the last
Thank you,
thing,
ma'am.
yeah, no problem. So the last text which I had in mind, which for reasons of time I cannot talk about, is Sarah Joseph's Gift of Green, where there is a similar, emphasis on marshlands. This is about a Dalit Pulaya community. So you have the subaltern human and the subaltern landscape in close conjunction, and both these subalterns are givers of life. And this is a novel which talks about the importance of narratives or storytelling. So to end, since we have to end, um, let me put it this way. I'm going to end with a story. Eco-critical praxis facilitates a major shift in perception, a coming home to the realization that the world is your body. So this is the story I'm going to end with. The image of Indra's net from the Avatamsaka Sutra. It's a story which is used by quantum physicists as well to talk about interconnectedness and the interdependency of quantum connections that interlace the entire universe, connecting us to every part and a particle. So Indra has this beautiful net of jewels hung all around his palace. At the nodal juncture of this net, filling the whole of space, is a multifaceted jewel which represents a life form or a unit of consciousness. So, since each of the jewels is intrinsically linked to the other jewels in the net, a slight change in one jewel is reflected in all the others and in the entirety of space. So, although represented in mythic terms, this image reminds us of the myriad strands that constitute the web of life. So, eco-critical praxis, I conclude, is one of the myriad ways of honoring what the Buddhists call a sangha, the great community of earth beings. Thank you so much, and thank you for your patient listening.
Hello.
Yes, uh,
Hello, ma'am. Swarnalata, ma'am. This is
yes,
Rama here. Ma'am, on behalf of the department, first of all, I think I should thank you so much because you have given us such an effective presentation about, and you proved time and again that you are an expert on environmental literature. So I think I have to share all my colleagues' thanks and our gratitude to you for having spent, because I know you had to squeeze in this time amidst your classes also. So I am extremely thankful to you for all the time, the patience you've given, and all the efforts taken to present so much of literature in so little time. So thank you once again, ma'am. Thank you so
thank
much.
you so much.
And
And
especially
especially
about the
about the
wetlands, I think you hadn't got enough time. We were actually waiting for, I think, Sarah Joseph's is a very impressive
yes,
book, but we were waiting. I think again, time played spoil sport because the participants are also waiting for their
no, no, I
session.
totally understand, and
So
thank you
yes,
so much for the
yeah,
opportunity. And
thank
it
you
was
so
wonderful
much,
being here.
ma'am. Thank you. Sylvia, take over.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rama ma'am. Thank you, ma'am, for your enlightening speech and insightful thoughts. Thank you so much, ma'am. Now we move to the second session of day one. Kavita, ma'am.